Hello, and welcome to this session on AI, generative AI, including ChatGPT, and academia. By the end of this session, you will be able to understand AI and generative AI, understand the uses of AI and programs such as ChatGPT. We will consider the ethical implications of using such tools and consider what the impact is within academia. A short disclaimer, whilst the librarian and the title team are also subjective, but true, I'll include it. We're not claiming to be experts in AI, so this session is intended to be a basic and generalist introduction to AI, artificial intelligence, and generative AI. So let's start by having an introduction to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence basically leverages computers and machines to mimic problem-solving and decision-making capabilities of the human mind. So AI are systems and processes that are in plenty of computer programs, softwares, and they tend to be pretty passive in support that they offer to the humans using those tools. So the example we have on screen here is the sort of auto word responses in many text communication programs such as WhatsApp and etc. These are simply looking at the algorithmic likelihood of the next word or letter that you will use and trying to prompt and provide that for you to speed up the process of that communication. So then, what is generative AI? Well, generative AI refers to the deep learning models that can generate high quality text, images, and other content based on the data they have been trained on. So here is a potentially familiar application of generative AI, which has been pretty passive. It's the PowerPoint Designer feature, which builds on top of the text-based inputs that you use onto the slides to create information, images, and designer elements to support the visual elements of the information you are delivering. So that is generating content and supporting elements that will help the reader understand the content that is being presented. So the reason this is interesting is because we have this artificial intelligence as part of many systems. And in the last year or so, there's been an absolute avalanche of generative AI being embedded into many different softwares and programs. Some of the more generalist ones that we may be familiar with include Magic Eraser in Google Photos, formula completion in Excel, and of course predictive text messaging in programs such as mobile phones. This image that is included on the screen indicates creative areas where software programs have integrated generative AI to speed up, adapt, and support users in creating new media and content. So this session is predominantly based on text-based generative AI models, although we are aware of, and hopefully we'll have future sessions covering other forms of media. So what are conversational text-based programs? Examples of these include Bard and ChatGPT. These may be the ones that you have heard of or have seen in the news. These are text-based programs. These are large language models that are specifically trained to input and output text-based programs based on these large systems of languages that they have access to. They are essentially basically large text predictors. So taking the example of your mobile phone and scaling that up into a larger model, it's able to use algorithms to predict what the likeliest next word or sentence should be. And it's able to do this because it's scraped the data from the internet, which is a rich location for conversational, formal and informal elements of language. So what we really need to be aware of is that they are not aware then in and of themselves. So the programs are just mathematically based algorithms. They do not understand the context with which the question is being asked or the output that is required as a result of that. So they are not able to be used necessarily in a safe or secure way. As with the internet in and of itself is not necessarily a safe or secure location if used inappropriately, such as the same with generative AI systems and tools. We still need to be aware and careful with how we engage with these systems. So the safety and security of your personal information is really important. So do not enter into any of these systems personally identifying information, just as you wouldn't go onto a new website and enter all of that information without being confident that that information is being protected. As it currently stands, legislation is being enacted to regulate the providers of these tools and systems, but currently those terms and conditions are essentially unknown. So at the moment, I would not recommend inputting personal information into these systems. So I've mentioned it a few times now that the generative AI tools are essentially, it's just a software tool, software update. So we have a nice quote here, which I think ties into the limitations of AI and generative AI really nicely. So essentially, a carpenter will see a power saw as just a tool to speed up the process. Somebody who doesn't know anything about carpentry will see the power saw as a replacement for carpenters. And ultimately, what I'm trying to get across with that quote is that a tool in the right hands can be really effective, useful, and can support the process of creation. However, if used inappropriately or viewed with the wrong understanding, then it will be not useful to you and ultimately potentially harmful. So that leads us to that next question of researching with AI. Is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? Well, it's a complex answer. Some of the issues that we can easily identify are that we can't identify the author because it's a large data source where they're not necessarily outputting a reference list, identifying the various data points that have gone into the output. Therefore, we have no idea of who those original authors are. We can't acknowledge them, we can't vet them, and we can't assess them for their suitability. So anything that is outputted from a text-based program, for example, is a little bit tricky to assess. Well, any form of media really would be hard to assess, but we can't identify those original authors, so therefore we can't make a judgment on whether that author is originally suited or qualified to give us an answer. Another question is that we have no idea of the combination or original sources of the data being used. We get into issues around copyright. Do the text large language models have copyright clearance to access those original sources of information? There are currently many cases going through the courts where we think that perhaps they do not have the copyright clearance to access those original sources. As a result of that, we need to be careful of using any of those outputs ourselves, as we might accidentally plagiarize ourselves. Another thing that we need to be aware of is ethics and bias. These systems are a result of the people who created the program, who may have conscious or unconscious bias, and therefore that bias naturally translates into the programs themselves. They are not free from bias, and therefore any of the outputs, we need to be aware of the implications of the stereotypes or the language being used in response to any output that is presented to us. This similarly ties into the hallucinations elements. At least 10 to 20% of the content that is outputted from these systems is identified as a quote-unquote hallucination, and what that means is that the information is completely made up. There is no foundation in the original data for the information system to present the sentence or the information as it does, saying people have done things when they haven't, saying that they have qualifications when they don't, coming up with references that simply do not exist. Therefore, if we do not have the skills, expertise to assess that information for its suitability and trustworthiness, it makes it a really complex and difficult process to discern which parts of the information outputted are good and which parts of the information are bad. And ultimately, if the purpose of a tool is to help us speed up our system or process, therefore then having to go through and vet every piece of information, it's not necessarily helping us speed up, because we will have to go through it and spend that time. It's not really any help to us in that scenario. One of the biggest issues that we have with the concept of researching with AI is that it is pulling information typically from Google, insofar as Google is a generalist location. It's generally aimed at people looking for publicly available information, and at university specifically, we're looking to move from that generalisms into being specialists, and therefore we need to start going to academic specialist locations, which are not typically available for free via the standard Google search. Not saying that you can't find good information that way, but typically it is not presented that way, and therefore the systems are not going to prioritise that academic information over the generalist information, again meaning it's a potentially frustrating and slower process. And one of the big issues that we have currently is that the information is not replicable. Different days, different people, we get different answers. And even the suppliers and creators of these tools and programs don't necessarily know why that is happening. And if it's not replicable, we cannot be necessarily confident that any student or any person is going to get the same information every time, leading to questions about inequity of access and information relevance. One of the big things that we do in information literacy in the library world is a thing called the CRAP test. I am a child, so that makes me laugh every time. But essentially, it's a little test that we can run on any source of information that we come across to assess its use and application for our purposes. So C stands for currency. Can we assess when the date of the information was published? So is it now outdated? Is it really recent? Has there been enough time for it to be assessed, valued and edited by experts in the field? The issue that we have with text-based large language models is, again, they don't tell us the data sources they are using, therefore the timeliness of that information is impossible to assess. Relevance is where we ask ourselves, is this information important to our needs? Because of the generalist nature of these large language models, they tend to be very broad in scope and not necessarily specific and niche and specialist enough for our purposes. So again, it's not necessarily helpful in speeding up the process, because we have to pass through and figure out which elements we need to then investigate and dig deeper into. Another question that we get is that authority question. Who is the author? Why are we giving them the power to tell us this information? What expertise do they have? We do not know any of the authors of the outputs of these large language tools, therefore we cannot assess them. Accuracy is an interesting one, it's a tricky one. We are looking for the reliability, the truthfulness and correctness of the content, and this relates back to the hallucination issue, where we know that at least 10 to 20% of the outputted content is going to be potentially inaccurate, and we would have to have the capacity and specialist skills to go through that information and dig it out and rectify that. And ultimately, we need to consider what is the purpose of the suppliers of this product in giving us access to this information. Now, typically with things like ChatGPT, there is now a paid for and free version, and of course they are making financial gains through accessing that information. And that circles back to the issue around copyright. Copyright is there to enable people to have intellectual property, to benefit from the materials that they have created, and essentially in the scenario where potentially these creators have stolen intellectual copyrighted materials, they are then making a benefit off of somebody else's works. So it's a complex and sticky issue for sure. So we really need to be aware of the biases that we get in AI and generative AI. For example, they are primarily trained currently on English language content, really limiting our access to non-English speakers and to people who have English as a secondary language. It's really leading to an English-centric bias, meaning that we are missing out on really rich and valuable information that is available in other countries and other languages. And again, it kind of comes back to that issue of researchers needing to be aware of the bias of the authors of any materials that they are accessing. This is particularly an issue in large language models because it magnifies any of those subtle biases, even if they are unconscious, in original authors' works, and the internet as a whole is not necessarily known to be an unbiased location. So these large language models, which are web scraping the internet, are therefore pulling through and extrapolating any of the issues that might have existed in that original content. So issues that we need to, considerations that we need to have when we are researching with AI tools. We need to understand the limitations of generative AI. We need to be able to discern fact from fiction, and are these tools telling us what we want to hear. We need to know about the bias that might be included in the creation of the program and the outputs of the systems, and the ethical implications of any stereotypes or conversations that those outputted text might have built within them. So that being said, there are definitely ways that we can use AI, generative AI programs such as ChatGPT that I am a fan of. Things like mind mapping, using it to spark ideas, writing suggestions, helping to pivot from first person to third person, looking into that formal tone, for example. We can ask it to outline an assignment for us, how to get that structure, or what needs to go into which sections. We can ask it for writing feedback, looking at learning objectives, for example. And we can also ask it for explanations to explain or summarise a complex concept into more informal language. I think that can be a really nice way of engaging with these systems. So we have an example here of a process that we could replicate. So on screen now we have my library and academic skills essay basic template. We've got introduction, middle sections, and a conclusion. And on the right, a similar structure produced by ChatGPT, but you could also have the added bonus of asking it to build your specific topic into that structure. And again, that's just a really nice jumping off point. So I just want to touch on briefly of how we can start to use and engage these systems, which might be, you might have heard called prompt engineering. So it's all about asking the right questions. So we need to consider who the output is for, what kind of level of language should be used. Is it for a child or a teacher or a grandparent? What format do we want the structure of the output to be? Is it for a social media post, or is it a story? And why do we want this information? What is our goal? What style do we want the information to be presented in? Is it to deliver information, or is it to be funny? So here we have an example: write a funny short story for a 6-year-old, where I've considered those various elements. And on screen we have a short story suitable for a 6-year-old. Now I have the capacity and capability to assess this information before I would share it out with anyone. Similarly, I've been able to adapt and change the example here to write a sad poem for an adult. We're looking at audience, we're looking for structure, and we're looking for content. Each of these elements, I have the capacity to assess the output and decide if that is suitable. I am an expert, in quote unquote, in this content. I can decide if it is suitable to be used, shared, or accessed in some way. So we have a nice flow chart here where we can assess, does the output need to be true? Okay, is it safe to use for your task? Does it matter if the output is true? Yes, you have the expertise to verify if the output is accurate, yes or no, unsafe to use. So if you are not an expert in this area, you cannot necessarily make those assessments, okay? So it's really important to understand where you could use something for fictional, support, fun writing, or for academic informed purposes, okay? So coming back to the original idea that we touched on here, which is the designer tool, it's nice and it's useful to use the designer element because it's not changing or creating that original content. I'm still the expert in writing that original information on screen, and then I'm just simply using the designer tool to support the delivery of that content. But ultimately, I'm still responsible for the content being presented. I have to take ownership of it. The best example I can give you is to consider it a little bit like writing code. So with researching and writing code, it only works if you can spot the errors in the middle of it. We call this learning the manual method. It means that you can understand how to research, write, and explain yourself, okay? You need to be able to identify and fix any errors or mistakes the tool produces for you. If you just put in code produced by these systems into a website, it may work for a period of time, but if you don't have the skills to fix it when it goes wrong, or if somebody else needs to come in and fix it later, they won't necessarily understand how you've arrived at this point, and when it stops working, you won't have the skill set to repair it. So a couple of academic ethical issues we need to identify are the purposes of assessment in university. So assessments are intended to show that you have taken in and learned information about a topic, so they're constantly building on information and works that you have done previously. So farming that work out to a large language model is not effective simply because it is going to be too broad, too generalist. It's not going to have your specific background, your specific research, your specific tone of voice embedded into that assignment, and it won't necessarily have that specific knowledge that is required and given to you in class. And ultimately, qualifications are valued because they show that that learning has taken place and been assessed. So it would devalue the whole qualification if we had no evidence that you had actually learned the topics, researched them, and were able to build on your previous works. Of course, there is the university's academic integrity policy and plagiarism, and it clearly states that students are required to hand in their own work, and that using a person or tool to present work that has not been worked on by the student counts as a break within the academic conduct policy. So what we say ultimately is that it's a great place to start, but it's a really terrible place to finish. You can use these tools to help jumpstart the process, to support the sort of structuring and the grammatical production of our writing, but ultimately the words need to be our own and we need to take ownership of them. This really comes back to the idea that students are scholars and we are all part of a scholarly community. Everyone at the university, the teachers, the researchers, the students, it's all part of an academic integral honesty program that we sign up to when we join the university. And it comes back to the idea of referencing and being able to track back the ideas and concepts of original authors, original creators of research, of concepts, theories, and being able to follow that referencing link back to that original source and then back to their references to see those original sources. And it's constantly this small building on top of other works. It's a really important process, and personally I think it's a really nice process where we can acknowledge and thank the people that have come before us and created these ideas and concepts and given them to us to analyse and to discuss and to build on, and hopefully someone else will come along and build on the works and ideas that we come up with and create. So it's all about having that evidence, all about identifying that authorship, and I just think that's a really nice process. If you want to know some more information, you can absolutely go and check out the AI and ChatGPT library guide, where we have more information, videos, etc. for you to watch and check out as things are changing and adapting every week, month, day, year. This area is really adapting and changing and growing, and I think it's really fascinating. So check out the guide, because that will be the place where any new content is added. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.